Today's guest is M Torrens, a serial entrepreneur, a professor of entrepreneurship, and someone who's navigated the wild ride of building and scaling companies with ADHD. In this episode, we dive into how his diagnosis transformed the way that he leads, the hidden superpowers of a hyperactive brain, and why most people have ADHD completely misunderstood. If you've ever felt that your brain is wired slightly differently, or you're leading someone else who is, this conversation is going to completely shift the way that you view things. Before we dive into the topic of ADHD, what I call like the hunter brain and entrepreneurship, can you provide me a bit of context around your own journey up until this point for the listeners? So a bit about like who you are, what you've done in the past, and what's led you to where you are today, please.
Yeah, my professional journey has been really interesting, a lot of fun. I wear two main hats. One, I'm the founder CEO of a healthcare company. It's called Sprout Therapy Group. We provide therapy and special ed services for young kids with disabilities. Got about 200 to 250 employees across a couple cities in upstate New York. And I've been doing that for almost 30 years. I sold the business for the first time back in 2008. And after that, I had taken a job as a faculty member teaching entrepreneurship at Syracuse University, which is a really well-ranked program. Bought the company back in 2011. So since then, I've been doing both. So I own and operate a company and I teach entrepreneurship. So I've got a really fun and interesting combination of practice of entrepreneurship and the teaching of entrepreneurship. So that's been great. Now, recently, I've kind of unwound myself from my operating role at my company. So I don't really have a daily operating role, or I'm not involved in any normal process. I kind of identify more as a professor of entrepreneurship nowadays than I do as a business owner. So it's been a nice transition and a great place to be right now.
Amazing. Love that. I quite like that. The ring to that as well. Professional of entrepreneurship. That's a nice title. Just out of curiosity, like what led to you building those businesses in the first place?
I'm a speech language pathologist by training. I went to graduate school to be a speech language pathologist. I took my first job right out of school, working in a setting that I didn't really like all that much. I had part of my education was funded by the state, and in exchange, I had to work for them for a year and a half in a setting that they traditionally had trouble recruiting for. And once I got there, I realized why that was the case. So, I left that job earlier than my commitment. So I had to repay a bunch of interest and fees and penalties. And I just went out and hung my own shingle and thought, hey, anything's got to be better than this job that I didn't really like that much. I mean, the people were wonderful. The clients were wonderful. I didn't like the setting. I didn't like the type of work that I was doing. And I thought that if I could control my own destiny, then, ultimately I'd be more fulfilled professionally. So I just started as a solo practitioner, and I was doing speech therapy for young kids with either stuttering or articulation problems or language delays. And then I started picking up contracts with different state or education agencies and realized that my income was going to be limited to the number of hours in my day. So I thought, well, maybe I could just hire somebody. I figured that out, and I hired somebody else, and just kind of grew it from there.
I like that. It's a nice evolution as well, and the story behind that. So what I'm interested in exploring, because for transparency and context on my end, I came across yourself from the TED Talk that you did. It's like 6 to 8 years ago, I believe, if I've got the numbers right as to time.
Yeah, I think it was 2019, I think.
Cool. And I know that did very well with like its numbers. It's done over like 400 and something thousand views, which is awesome. And I really like resonated with the message that was in there. Won't like speak and verbatim for everything that's in there. I'll urge everyone to go and watch that, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. When did ADHD for you come into the picture of this context?
Funny thing is, it's always been there. I just didn't know what it was. And there may be a lot of people in that situation. Along the way, I knew that I was maybe a little bit different. I didn't know why necessarily. In some cases, it worked for me. In other cases, it didn't. But it really came to a head when my company was in a very high growth phase. And I was doing things that I liked. I was doing them really well. But I noticed that the systems as they were that I had around me and the people that I had around me, who were incredible people, really good at what they did, they were struggling because of me and the way I worked and the way I operated. So at the time, I was working with a CEO coach who thought hey, have you ever thought of ADHD? Maybe you should go talk to somebody about this. So, I thought at first I thought, oh, maybe, but what's it going to do even if I do have a diagnosis, right? What's the big deal? So I went and met with a few people, ended up going through a formal process with a psychiatrist. And, at the end of it, he was like, yeah, you've had ADHD your whole life. It's just now becoming a problem for you. Sometimes it becomes a problem earlier, sometimes later, but here it is right in your face. And part of the process was actually doing this very exhaustive educational history. So I had to, have my parents send me my report cards from, elementary school, right? And when you read the comments from all my teachers, it was the same, right? It's like, John gets his work done early and then distracts the other kids in class, or he'll blurt out answers without raising his hand, or, he doesn't hand in his homework, but we find it in his backpack a week later, things like that, right? So it all kind of came together for me, and I realized, oh, so yeah, this is how I've operated my whole life. And now in this context, I can see where it's worked for me. And now it's starting to fall apart because of the stage in my entrepreneurial life cycle that I'm at. And that's kind of where it came together. So I think it's probably my early 40s, I think, where I ended up getting diagnosed.
Interesting. I've got a couple of follow-up questions from that, but I'll present them in chronological order. Back at the symptoms that you were aware of, but weren't necessarily able to like put your finger on as regards to like what was causing it. What were some of those in like your early life that you were able to now maybe connect the dots and go, that makes sense now?
Things like procrastination, right? And we all procrastinate, but I think, when you have ADHD and you're procrastinating, it can feel a little bit more intense or feel longer, right? So I would procrastinate on things. I would wait to the very last minute and do a pretty good job on something, but I just knew that, hey, if I had only started this a few days ago, this could have been a really amazing end product, right? And other or things that worked really well for me. Like I was the kid who sold more raffle tickets than anybody else in any competition. So if there was a competition about selling something or raising money for your class, I always did really well. So it was that kind of yin and yang of where it was harming me and where it was helping me. Didn't really put it together until much later, but looking back on it, you could see where it showed up.
Yeah, makes total sense. And what's interesting, just something that I've over the past couple of years seen, like you mentioned that I think it was your psychiatrist that maybe said this to you, that you've always had it, but it's almost now becoming a problem or a challenge, and that's why you're aware of it. And the way that it was explained to me is that it's almost like in two parts, and two things have to be present for us to almost like be aware of it. You've got the actual genetic predisposition, and then you've got the environment. And it's like someone can have the predisposition of like ADHD, but they don't necessarily find themselves in environments frequently enough, at least, that turn it into being like destructive or a problem where they're then aware of the traits. It's that almost like beautiful harmony or destructive harmony, we can call it, where it then almost like brings everything out when the genetics, as it were, and the environment collide. And for you, that was at 40, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It was at a period of rapid growth. So that part of the research I was involved with was looking at the connection between ADHD and entrepreneurship. And, I'm lucky that at the university, my office is right next door to one of the premier academics and researchers on the planet on this topic. And I just went to him one day and I said, hey, I'm a member of this organization. It's called YPO, Young Presidents Organization, a large peer network of CEOs throughout the world. And I just noticed that, a lot of members seem to have ADHD. And can you hear the background noise right now? Because we've got a gardener here. Let me go shut my door. Hold on.
Fine.
Sorry about that.
But that's fine.
Anyway, yeah. So, among the membership of YPO, it was just my observation that, there's a lot of people who operate and are wired the same as me. So we ended up doing a project. We researched traits among these YPO members. So anyway, the end result was that in the context of entrepreneurship, ADHD can be a significant advantage in a number of ways. So when I was early in my career, starting the company, when there was resource scarcity and you're hustling and you're selling and you're assembling a team and it's just chaotic anyway, I was thriving because chaos was my happy place. I could do really well there. Now, when it got to the place where we needed coherent allocation of resources, policies, procedures, professionalism, that sort of thing, that's when things started to get more challenging for me because my natural abilities didn't really line up with the requirements of the company at that time. And that's where my leadership started to falter. I wasn't leading properly. I wasn't leading the people I had in the way they needed to be led, and so on. And I was doing things that looked maybe um, dysfunctional, even though in my own brain, it's just the way I've always done them. But my company was in a completely different place in its journey than it was when I was acting in the way that was super functional, according to the way I was wired. So it was working really well until it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't is because the company needed a different set of traits than I was able to provide at the time.
How did that feel for you at that point as well? Like the whole exploration of like ADHD. I know you said that that kind of came through getting a CEO coach. Like, I know obviously business at the best of times is chaotic and high pressure, etc. Right now,
Yeah.
I would imagine that adds an extra layer of complexity because you're not only handling the external environment of business, but you're also trying to work out the internal game of that as well. Like, just curious what that was like for you.
It was humbling, especially to realize that, oh, yeah, like all of this is my problem, right? And it's on me. But really, I didn't. Getting the diagnosis didn't really change much about the way I viewed myself or the way I operate in the world. I just kind of viewed it as something that I had to get a grip on. Right. It was almost like I viewed it as a character trait, not necessarily a flaw, but some people maybe are hot-headed and have a temper, other people may be lazy, other or whatever the trait is. I just viewed it as a set of traits that I had to manage in order to get the outcomes that I wanted. And that's the thing is making sure you can harness all of these gifts that you have when you have ADHD and harness them in a way that's going to be functional and work for you in the context of entrepreneurship. I don't want anybody to get the sense that I'm saying that ADHD is a blessing, it's a great thing, and you definitely want this if you're going to be an entrepreneur, because it can be very debilitating and it has a lot of very negative outcomes. All I'm saying is that in the context of entrepreneurship, it can be an advantage if the traits are harnessed. And that was kind of the research we did. That's been some of the work I was doing with young entrepreneurs at the university.
Nice. And I resonate with that wholeheartedly with like clients that I work with myself as well. I think there are naturally lots of innate challenges that do come with it. I think a large portion of that is like internal as well. It's like the shame and stigma that's usually associated with like the label. I think I had a similar experience to yourself, which is why I really wanted to get you on today as well, because I resonated quite highly with what you were talking about in the when I got the diagnosis, I didn't see myself as being disabled or disordered, as obviously
Yeah.
the label actually suggests. And I loved your framing, which was it's not a disability, it's just a different ability ultimately
Yeah.
in those about words.
Yeah, it is just a different set of abilities. And it's weird to think of yourself as disabled or disordered when you certainly don't feel that way, right? You can certainly feel dysfunctional in some contexts, right? But in others it was I could outperform people in ways that were very functional sometimes, so it's two sides of a coin. So for example, one of the traits, and I should say that this really only correlates with hyperactive and impulsive ADHD. The inattentive type doesn't correlate well with entrepreneurial outcomes. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that it's not blanket for ADHD. It's specifically hyperactive and impulsive. So for example, one of the traits of hyperactive impulsive ADHD. And there's a list of like 11 of them. And if you have 6 of them, then you qualify for a diagnosis or something, right? One is low perseverance. And low perseverance, you might think, well, when it's not working well or it's dysfunctional or it's harming you, it appears that you're just giving up too soon or you can't finish a task that you started or something like that, right? But when it's functional and it's working for you, and if you can harness it this way, it looks like you're able to move on quickly, right? You're not beating yourself up after a failure. You're looking at an opportunity, you're realizing quickly there is no opportunity there, so you move on. So low perseverance could be giving up too soon, or it could be moving on at the right time and cutting your losses. Another great example of these traits is high sensation seeking, right? A lot of people with impulsive hyperactive ADHD, it's about sensation seeking, right? So when it's not working for you, people could say, hey, you've got shiny object syndrome, right? Because you're looking for the next shiny thing. We hear that a lot. But when it's working for you, you can look like a savant when it comes to finding new opportunities because you're always looking, you're always seeking those sensations. So yes, on one side, it could be harmful and it could get in your way if you're not harnessing it and managing it. But on the other side, it could be a real advantage because other people don't operate that way.
Again, totally agree. Something that has helped myself and clients is just seeing things as like just they objectively are, as opposed to having the subjective eye put an impression on it, such as usually will be shame or something along those
Right.
lines, right? And it's then everything just as a whole has light and dark to it. And it's if you have a high tendency for distractibility, then in certain contexts, that's not appropriate. But in others, as you've rightly mentioned, highly appropriate and not advantageous. So it can't be objectively bad if there is a light side to it as well. And I think that can help from the identity aspect. I know that wasn't necessarily something that either one of us struggled with, but I'm aware that there are a lot of people that do, that they don't pursue a diagnosis, or maybe they don't even care to, but they then won't explore things further because they don't want to be labeling themselves or seen as someone who has ADHD. And I think that can definitely help, is to be able to recognize it in it just is. Like there's no good or bad. Very much like I had laser eye surgery this year because my eyesight wasn't great. It's similar,
Mm-hmm.
right? When
Yeah.
I was 15, 14, I recognized that I can't see the whiteboard and everyone else
Right.
can. So
Yeah.
I had to go through a process of putting things in place so that I could get the result that everyone else did.
Yeah. And, going back to this idea that it's a disability or disorder versus just a different set of abilities, it's often diagnosed at the urging of a teacher, right? Because maybe the child or the student is a little bit too unruly or distracting other students, or for whatever reason, that child doesn't fit neatly into the box that public education needs you to fit into in order to get through, the public education system at scale the way they have it. So a lot of times children are being medicated for the convenience of the adults in their life, not as a way to get the best out of them. And I'm not saying in all cases. I mean, I know people who take medication and it is a profound difference for them. But I do believe that there is an element of convenience for the adults in these kids' lives. It's just easier to teach a kid who's on medication if they're not distractible and bouncing all over the room or whatever. So there is a balance there, and I think we've come to accept it as a disability for that reason. I think if the education system were a little bit different, or we valued different things among children, that it would be considered differently, but it's not. And I don't blame educators at all. They're busy, they're overworked. It's hard to differentiate instruction when you have 30 kids in the room and no aides and that sort of thing. So absolutely not blaming educators. It's really the system that they're working in that is part of the problem.
And it's interesting how like that system and then a corporate based system can be very similar. And I think
Mhm.
that if you're unaware of like your brain type, as it were, then you can it can always feel like you're trying to push water uphill continuously.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
it's heavily friction based like life that you end up being put in, because it's a system that's designed for like farmers, as I call them, as
Mhm.
opposed to like hunter brains. Again,
Yeah.
neither one is good or bad. They just
Right.
are. But
Yeah.
because the farmers are in larger numbers, the system is therefore like designed for them. But then the 10 to 12% of those who at least have diagnosis don't fit that system. And then it has this knock-on effect elsewhere, because it's not only those things that happen in a vacuum for that period of their life. It then means that, well, maybe in the really important years, they're not getting the help and nurturing and need requirements that they need. Thus, how does that impact later in life and
Right.
esteem and all those things?
Yeah. And it's a matter of getting in the right professional lane, I guess, right? So if you have hyperactive or impulsive ADHD, maybe being an accountant or a copy editor, proofreader isn't your calling. Maybe it's something more in creative, sales, marketing, or even founding a company. I mean, the founders that we interviewed and polled, 60, I think it was 63% of them had traits consistent with an ADHD diagnosis, which is much higher than the general populations. There is definitely something there. And part of the reason is if you're a child with ADHD coming up through the public education system, you're not going to be that kid who succeeds in that credentials arms race in order to get into the best school or an Ivy League school and go work for the best private equity or law firm and that type of thing, right? You're not going to be the best employment candidate for a variety of reasons. So oftentimes we're in the position of having to create our own livelihoods because we're not great employment candidates based on traditional measurements, right? So I think there's a variety of reasons why we end up seeing a lot of founder CEOs with ADHD.
Agreed. And to a comment that you made earlier on your own journey is to be in charge of your own destiny. And I think that's a trait that is symptomatic with having like the hunter brain and ADHD symptoms, at least. Whether it's a cause or an effect, I'm unsure. But I believe a part to play is the fact that we spend so many years in the early stages feeling like we don't fit the system or that it's really difficult to be a part of.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, we kind of create this internal world of, well, I'll just go create my own world, or I'll grab life by the balls, and I will just go and create my own lane. And I know that was very relevant for me at that point in my life. It was, I don't fit this. I also tell I'm not going to fit university. However, I want to get into entrepreneurship, and that was always a desire of mine. I didn't even know what I was going to do, but I knew it would just be where I could have a high level of agency and autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think agency and autonomy are important. I mean, so for me, that's one of my, driving factors, right? I need autonomy and agency and independence, right? So, I mean, I'm a company founder several times over, and now my real job is in academia, which you have a tremendous amount of autonomy. And so luckily for me, those work for me, right? But having a corporate 9 to 5 just wouldn't work for me because I just those types of constraints, even though they may be even in practice, like I could absolutely do it, just knowing that I have those constraints would be hard to deal with.
Yeah, totally get that. And before it evades my mind, something I am curious about that you said earlier is you made the point, which was interesting and rightly so, about the 63% and how those who have hyperactive impulsive ADHD will naturally congregate in the entrepreneurial world and do well in the entrepreneurial world, but not necessarily the inattentive. What were the findings that you found around the inattentive, and maybe why not?
Well, so we didn't actually look at inattentive. So the previous research that had been done had been on hyperactive and impulsive types. So that we kind of went with that. Because the inattentive, it's like forgetfulness and things like that, and they just anecdotally didn't seem like they would stack up. So when we did the survey of traits, we didn't realize it at the time, but we were sort of filtering that out naturally. So all the traits that people identified with happened to be the impulsive and hyperactive traits.
Interesting. Yeah. Anecdotally, do you have any experience coming across a founder who is potentially in the camp of maybe combined or maybe more so the inattentive and the natural, as you just said, traits that come with that? Do you believe that there is a way that they can succeed by potentially putting the right system structure and maybe people around them?
For sure. I mean, I believe everybody can succeed with the right circumstances, right? But with inattentive, so for example, one of the things we know about entrepreneurial success is that action is one of the keys. And one of the traits about inattentive ADHD is just this difficulty getting started. All right. Whereas hyperactive impulsive ADHD, you can get started all day long. It's finishing that's problematic sometimes, right? So that's one area where, just in the context of entrepreneurship, the difficulty getting started or taking that first action is naturally going to impede your ability to start a company. It's not impossible to do it, but you will need to set up, your ecosystem appropriately, maybe with a good co-founder or a good team or, a project or a problem you're trying to solve that you really are passionate about or resonate with, something that's going to get you over that humping, that difficulty getting started in the first place, as an example.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I think, to my understanding, through the research that I've looked at, I think a large portion of people now fit into the combined, which it's like it can blur the lines, right, as to like what side you fall on it, as it states, right, is that you probably will know, more than likely, sorry, find that you have traits of both, which hence being combined. I think then it just comes down to, as you said, like putting the right infrastructure in place, having the right ecosystem, the right support available, because ultimately, and this is where I think awareness comes in, and this is why
Yeah.
a big part of my mission is to like bring awareness to this and to get rid of it being stigmatized and taboo, and it really is over this side
Yeah.
of the water, where the support and information is quite sparse.
Hmm.
There is, we suffer with quite a few things, from tall poppy syndrome to, you know, all these other ones where naturally everybody wants to save face and nobody likes to stick out. And
Mm.
having like a label and a deficit or a disorder, as all of these kind of words are thrown around, it then means that we're lacking the openness to become more aware and then put the infrastructure in place. So yeah, that comes with its complexities.
Yeah.
One thing
Yeah.
that
I
I
mean,
wanted to go on,
don't forget the highly subjective nature of these diagnoses, right? I mean, it's not like a blood test where they can say, "Oh, you've got this biomarker, and so you've got ADHD," right? It's just somebody who's had some training, going through a list of traits and identifying them with you, right? So it's very subjective in nature, and it's not that it's not standardized, right? Because I think the people who are trained and professional to do this, they do a wonderful job, but it's not a highly precise diagnostic process. So just keep that in mind, for people, just because you have a diagnosis, it truly doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. All it means is that you've got this collection of traits that when you put them all together, they qualify you for a medical diagnosis. But that's really all it means. It doesn't mean that you're going to suffer more in life necessarily. I mean, it could mean that, but it just means you have different challenges, and everybody's got challenges.
right? And what's your view on it being a spectrum?
What's that?
What's your view on it being a spectrum?
Oh
So
yeah, for sure. I definitely I agree with that, right? Because you could meet 100 people with an ADHD diagnosis of hyperactive impulsive ADHD, and they're going to present 100 different ways. So yeah, again, it's not a precise diagnosis. It's not even a precise definition per se. Yeah, so I do believe it's a spectrum, a continuum, a kind of a loose amalgamation of traits that you could or could not have.
that's it.
Yeah.
I think again that viewpoint of it being like binary, which is why I kind of wanted to shine a light on it, is that you either do or you don't, and it's you qualify or you don't. And I think again that can add a layer of friction to this, where lots of my clients don't have, and the people that I speak to and work with and on podcasts don't have necessarily like a diagnosis, but they can see themselves with the traits and they put themselves at the center of like the hunter brain, as it were, and they're able to be like, oh, I can see me there, but
Mhm.
I don't actually have a desire to go and seek out the diagnosis.
Mhm.
I'm able to be aware that I suffer with that trait or I have that pain, and I quite like to
Yeah.
put the thing in place to try and mitigate that.
Yeah, or for me, it was helpful to know, okay, this is why I show up in different settings the way I do, or this is why I react to certain things the way I do. So in my case, and this is very typical, you go down the medication pathway, right? Because the psychiatrist, they they do medication, right? That's one of the things they do. So I tried all the different meds. Some of them worked, like they were able to manage my hyperactive impulsive symptoms, but the side effects were just not workable, right? So I wasn't sleeping, which is one of the things we know. A good sleep habits and good sleep hygiene is one of the things that really helps mitigate the negative side effects or the negative impacts of ADHD. So I wasn't sleeping. My appetite was terrible. Nutritional biochemistry, super important for people with ADHD. The side effects that I was getting were probably undoing any of the benefit I was getting from my ability to focus. And I wasn't myself, didn't feel myself. So I just kind of went on this path of trying to do this in a different way, right? I was like, okay, I can, maybe I can manage myself, right? I can govern myself. I have agency over the way I behave and the way I act, and I'm interested in growth and development. So maybe I could do this. So that kind of set me on this path of how do I do this holistically, naturally, without a pharmaceutical, which didn't really help me in totality, right? It helped a very specific symptom, but it caused all sorts of other problems, which were not making me healthy at all. So that's why I kind of went down that path of seeking an alternative way to manage my symptoms.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there was something I believe in the TED talk that you referenced that was, as you speak about it as having entrepreneurial superpowers. And I think you mentioned that it was like having kryptonite around your neck and it was
Yeah.
interfering with the superpowers. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I could maybe focus on something, that I might not be able to focus on, but like I just felt I felt like I still had creativity, but I didn't necessarily care to turn it on, if that makes any sense, right? Like there's a problem that we were looking at maybe, and like I knew like th- through this weird fog, I could see that there's definitely different ways to solve it, but I was like, I don't really feel like taking that path. Let's just kind of, decide how we're going to solve it and move on. So it almost feels like it tamped down my innovation or my creativity. It didn't totally block it out because like in a weird way, I could see that there were other pathways. I just didn't have maybe the energy or the desire to kind of blow that whole thing up and look at all the pieces, right? Which when I'm not on medication, like I'm ready to blow it up, right? Let's create the chaos and then kind of, get back into some sort of synchronous harmonious rhythm here. So I think maybe I didn't describe it that well, but I think bottom line is that I could see pathways to creativity. I just didn't have the desire to follow it, I guess.
That makes total sense. And I completely understand what you're saying there. Because when not on medication, my assumption would be, as someone who doesn't medicate, you don't have a choice. It's getting blown up. Like the thing is
Yeah.
getting blown up. And whether I like it or not, and it's being pulled apart, and I'm divergently thinking, and I'm constantly thinking of the ways that you can innovate and taking things from other industries and etc. Like
Yeah.
that's not a choice. That's just something that happens. And
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Right. And then you've got this chemical that's limiting that, but you still know it's there. You still know it exists, right? So you know you've got this ability, but you're just like, that's we don't want to follow that right now, or something, right? You're not choosing it, you're not turning it on, or something to that effect.
yeah. Was there a catalyst moment where you really noticed that it started to dampen those superpowers, where you made that decision to no longer pursue it?
I mean, it's really my sleep and my appetite. Those were and we know that when you're not sleeping, you're also not as innovative, you're not as creative. You don't establish, maintain, and nurture relationships as well as when you are sleeping. That right away for me, and especially for somebody who completely values sleep. Like before that, I was a pretty elite sleeper. And then since then I've gotten pretty good at, all my sleep metrics. So that was a big one. And of course, when it came down to, just diet and nutrition, I didn't really have an appetite, and I love food and I love to eat. And I wasn't interested in food. And of course, if you're not providing your body with the nutrition it needs, you're also not creative. You're not nurturing relationships. You don't have stamina. All sorts of things go wrong. But hey, I could focus on something, and maybe I was easier for other people to deal with. Right. But I was actually making myself sicker physically by doing that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, absolutely. And I think that would definitely be enough to turn me off the idea of doing it. Because I know when my food and my sleep is out of sync, I still have, it's almost like you said earlier, right? That the awareness of like what's inside, and it's
Yeah.
this energy that's constantly whirring around, but I can't actually expend any of it. So I feel like I'm going to like internally combust at times, and
Yeah.
I can't actually like wave the magic wand and make stuff come out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel pretty useless when I'm in those zones.
Yeah.
So yeah, wholeheartedly can understand that. Now, circling back to almost the point of which where you started to explore the ADHD traits and getting the diagnosis. The catalyst for you, from what you said there, was potentially getting feedback from other people around you becoming difficult to work with
Mm-hmm.
in a lack of different words. How have you now managed that? So you've gained the awareness, you've gained the diagnosis, you've trialed out medication, you've now come off medication. I'm assuming, like as you say, self-governing. Curious what your tactics are. We'll talk like strictly business for a second, and obviously like personal, I'd imagine, will come into it. And then I would be curious to actually look at the personal side of things if you're happy to as well.
Yeah. And it's really a combination of both, right? I don't look at them as, here are my strategies when I'm in business, and here's, personal strategies. They all kind of work together, and they all start with me. But like in a business context, it was really important for me to have that number two, or that person that I had deputized to call me out. Right. So, for example, we just have a day-long strategic planning meeting and we set our direction. The next day, I'm at the water cooler talking about this great new thing that we should check out. And they're the ones who are like, hey, okay, how are we going to resource that? Who's going to do it? And what did we just agree to that we have to give up in order to pursue this crazy idea that you have now? Right. So that person who has the permission to call me out and say, great, but how do we actually do this and bring me back down to earth? Right, knowing that they're not going to get in trouble for it. I'm not going to look at them like, they're the wet blanket. I'm actually asking them, hey, you know, give me some feedback here, things like that. No meetings without agendas, no meetings longer than 20 minutes unless, there's really something to dig into. Try to get any kind of heavy work done early in the morning when I'm fresh and that sort of thing. So those types of things in a business environment. But in general, as a human, all the things we know about, human performance and health apply and make it better in terms of your traits. So getting a good night's sleep, like, you've probably talked to sleep experts. I've had sleep experts on my show before, and learning about these things has been profound. Even things you didn't even think about, like, no screens 2 hours before bed. The biggest thing for me has been managing my last meal of the day. So the earlier in the day I can have my last meal, the better my sleep architecture is. So that has been super helpful. And my sleep has been incredible since I started dialing all these things in. I wear blue light blocking glasses. Once the sun goes down, if I do have to look at my computer, I have a whole wind down routine. I don't do alcohol, generally speaking, at least 3 hours before bed. If I do drink, it's usually like day drinking, outside on the beach or, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So I really manage my sleep very well. I'm focused on my nutrition as well. I have vices like, ice cream is just, my thing. I could eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if I was left to my own devices, right? So, I have to manage myself there, but I do generally have a pretty good um, diet. And then the other thing is just a movement practice. And, for me, when I live part of the year in Costa Rica, so surfing every morning is super important, not only for the activity and the exercise, but just for the grounding, being in the water, on the earth, that kind of thing, super important for me. But when I'm not able to do that, I like to cycle or walk or just be outside, things like that. So managing, diet, exercise, sleep, super important, right? And I kind of think of it as, if you imagine like your inputs and outputs, right? So what are you inputting? Not only through your mouth, right? Like, food, the right food, avoiding sugars, dyes, caffeine, things like that. But what are you consuming through your eyes and ears? Like, do you have like your stock ticker and your WhatsApp and your message? Do you have like 5 different screens going on, exciting you all the time? Are you watching a lot of news that's just in this doom and gloom cycle? Like, what inputs are you bringing in, right? Because that is just going to cloud your thinking and create a lot of noise. And likewise, what are you putting out? So do you have a movement practice? Are you doing the things that you're uniquely suited to do? And are you delegating the things that you're not uniquely suited to do, right? So giving the things that you maybe procrastinate or resist to somebody who's actually really good at it and likes it. Those types of things from an input and output perspective are super important.
Yep, and that's a brilliant way to put it as well, and a great frame for people to adopt. I often call it like the information diet as well, because we
Mhm.
often refer to obviously the diet that
Yeah.
goes in our mouth, and
Uh-huh.
it's crazy how much of an impact and influence that has when you look at like the neuroscience behind it, and then you really like test it out for yourself. Where like I've been, because I follow a similar pattern to yourself, where I get my big creative deep work block done early in the day, but I'm
Mhm.
now and have been for a while abstaining from screens, etc., for like a period before that.
Mhm.
And I've
Yeah.
noticed that like productivity, concentration, ability to focus, all these things net for the day is significantly greater by starting my day off and like working for dopamine. So I'll typically like before going on phones, I'll have some form of like cold water exposure because it sucks.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
love
like,
that. That's
but
great.
you get the
Yeah.
dopamine from that, and I have to endure
Yeah.
some pain. I
Yeah.
will like go out for a walk. I usually train midday, and just by those little things that cost nothing and
Mhm.
require very little effort, really, in the grand scheme of things, what that does, as I say, net for the whole day from a concentration point of view. Like it's not just then and there; it's like the lasting
Right.
effect is
Yeah.
great. Yeah, really, really
Yeah,
so.
for sure. And the other question I ask myself a lot is, is what I'm doing right now making me a contributor or a consumer? Right, especially like, if it comes to scrolling or whatever, like you're just consuming mindlessly. So I try to focus my efforts on contributing something versus consuming other things, right? So that's been helpful for me as well. The other thing, probably the most profound thing that I found, and there's some research to support this too, and it's for, and I know you talk about, the hunter brain and that kind of thing, but getting out of your head, so important, right? And like the research that's out there now about heart brain coherence, the heart actually sends more information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. So if you can get out of your brain, which is that whole information diet is super important, right? Because you've got to be able to get rid of the noise so you can see the signal. And if you can get into a coherent heart rhythm, that creates this ability to cut through the noise and get signal. And in my experience, getting into a coherent heart rhythm is what enables me to tap into innovation and creative thinking in ways that I couldn't even before, when I thought I was managing it. So a meditative practice, some sort of mindfulness practice, or even just heart-centered breathing, that kind of thing, profound impacts, in my opinion, and in the literature as well.
Interesting. No, I like that. Like my routine is I have some form of like mindfulness in place, but I probably extend more to like the journaling practice. So that's
Mm-hmm.
a note that I'll take as well to implement for myself. What's the cadence that you do that on for you? Is your form like meditative, and is that as frequently as you can?
Yeah, so there's I was so into this that a year ago I became a HeartMath Institute facilitator. So it's actually a really if you go to the HeartMath Institute's website, the content and education they have there is incredible. The hard science on this is mind blowing. But for me, it's usually like a 5 second rhythm, 5 seconds inhale, 5 seconds exhale, somewhere around there, depending on my state. But you can literally just breathe your way into a coherent heart rhythm. And then other techniques like focusing on the center of your heart, bringing in a feeling of gratitude or joy or love or something like that will actually feed that back to the brain. So you can just breathe your way into heart coherence. You could also focus on the center of your heart. You can bring in, I guess, better emotions that will up the ante and get you even more creative. But it's really quite simple, but not easy to implement all the time. But yeah, I would check out the HeartMath Institute's website. Lots of incredible science and great information there.
Nice, I definitely will. And one thing I do in the journal is practice the gratitude. And your thought
Mm-hmm.
there is that you speak to is great because like joy, gratitude, love, all of those like high frequency feelings, you can't think your way to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to almost like open yourself up to like feel them, and that's that difference, right, between
Yeah.
the brain and the body connection, which is super
Yeah.
interesting because like the hunter brain, like for context, is just the name and the aspirational identity that I give as like an opposition to ADHD. Going back to what I said about the
Yeah.
stigma and that
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it seems more aspirational, and I think more people would want to put themselves in that. And there's a story arc behind it as to
Yeah.
why that's the case. Comes from Tom Hartman, which I found
Mhm.
to be
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, and those feelings and emotions you mentioned, joy, gratitude, appreciation, like you said, those are higher frequency, but they're also much more coherent rhythms as well. And if you looked at a graph of these or a 3D image of the signals, the way they get sent out from your heart center, they're actually very attractive and pleasing to look at. They're very organized. They're very calming, right? When you look at graphs of fear and anger and anxiety and frustration, they're very disorganized and they're very displeasing to look at. So it's kind of, interesting how, the visual representation of these emotions that we feel kind of amplify or reinforce the nature of those emotions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
I really like that, and I'm going to put that into my own practice. Now, before we move into the just a little segment at the very end of like a rapid fire question, I am going to backstep just through personal curiosity, going to and I know my clients will kick off if I don't raise this because this is something that's a sticky point for a lot of people. You mentioned hiring a number two and getting someone in your corner who is able to, as you rightfully said, like call out your blind spots, etc. I'd be really interested to hear your process of doing that and like maybe the mistakes that you made through that and how you were able to create that cohesive relationship as a founder with with a number two? That'd be really valuable.
Yeah, in my case, I was super lucky because in each instance, I already had that person there who knew, like, it was almost like a joke between us anyway about how distractible I am or whatever, right? So, so when it became serious, it was just a conversation like, hey, all the things we've been joking about, now I've got this formal diagnosis, and I want to be able to harness this and manage it, and will you help me? And inevitably people want to help, right? So just kind of coming up with the rules of engagement, or hey, when you see me do this, this is the signal, or whatever it is. But I was very lucky that I had people in the organization who were more than happy to take that role, right? Because they knew not only would it help me, but it would help them, it would help everybody else they worked with. So it's just a matter of having an open, frank, vulnerable conversation about it. And it wasn't surprising that they were so ready to help, but it was very gratifying to know that, yeah, they're ready to step up and do that. And it's not the most comfortable position to ask somebody to take, right? Where they're calling the boss out. So it kind of depends on the relationship you have already and the way you've been leading. It all goes back to just having a real open, vulnerable conversation that has a spirit of positive intent about it. And, in my experience, it's always worked out really well.
No, great. That's really great to hear. And just like quick fire, what are the things that you first either offloaded or put in as like a practice for them to help you with?
Yeah. So just in meetings in general, having somebody just take notes for me, right? Just because I wasn't going to take notes, and I always thought I remembered everything, which of course I never did. So yeah, so just a quick note taker, right? Somebody to kind of be that deflector, right? Almost like a really good executive assistant would be, but just maybe with a little more awareness of the way I'm wired. And just like a signal. So for me, it was always, the verbal signal is, oh, that's a really great idea, but how are we going to resource it? That was like, so that made me think, okay, yeah, you're right. We've allocated all our resources. So how do we resource this, or what do we have to give up in exchange? Right. And that was the other thing is, okay, well, what do we have to stop doing? Right. Because I never wanted to stop doing anything. I just wanted to keep doing more or add more things. So the thought of, okay, what do we stop doing in order to do this amazing thing? And then when you think about it, you're like, well, if we stop doing something that's already generating revenue in order to chase this other thing that could generate revenue sometime in the future, we're probably going to take a step back. And, then it starts to get pretty clear. So just having a vocabulary that you agree on is usually enough.
Yeah, I really like that as well as like a personal anchor is
Mm-hmm.
as you rightfully said, which struck a chord with me is there's an abundance of ideas. There's an abundance of great ideas, all of which could possibly conquer the world. However, there is a finite amount of resources. And, I think the over enthusiasm of doing everything and not dropping anything is
Mm-hmm.
pretty present. And that's usually the default. So I really like the frame of what I have to give up in order to pursue this. And that almost gets you into like the logical part of your brain. It makes you stop and really think,
Yeah.
one, do we have the resources? Two, is this worth giving up other
Yeah.
successful, already implemented things to pursue? Maybe that's sometimes going to be the case, but often not. And
Right.
that's like a decision filter, I would assume. Yeah, really cool. So we'll quickly go into some short, punchy, rapid fire kind of
Yeah.
wrap up questions. So, what's one ADHD trait that's been the greatest asset for you as an entrepreneur?
I think being highly proactive, that's a trait that's very common, and that I have that for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What's a common myth about ADHD you wish more people understood?
Yeah. I think that it's a disability, and it can be, right? But it doesn't have to be.
And if you were to impart like one practical tip for someone trying to work like better with, maybe it's a partner, a team member, a spouse who has ADHD, so you're putting yourself into someone else's shoes who doesn't, and they're working with someone that does, what would that practical tip be to manage someone or to work with someone, should I say?
Yeah, have a real honest conversation about, hey, how do we do this together, right? And enlist the help of the other person, so they don't view it as you're working against them when you're really not.
Awesome. I love that. And what you're working on at the moment, and where can people find more about yourself and what you are working on?
Sure. Yeah. So my newest project that I'm really excited about is my podcast called The Total Entrepreneur: Mind, Body, Spirit, and we talk about how entrepreneurs can realize the ROI of prioritizing their mental, physical, and spiritual health. And it was really a result of me working with young students at a university where I see they're more anxious, they're less happy, they're feeling, less connected than they used to. And they're falling into this really dysfunctional hero worship of the people who work, 120 hours a week for their startup, and they don't eat, or they drink Soylent as their meal, and they have no relationships, but they're all about their business and that's how they're going to succeed. And that's really dangerous. So I thought, hey, what can I do, as an academic or, as a professor at a university? And I thought, maybe a podcast would be a good way to reach these young entrepreneurs. And it's been super fun. So we've been at it for almost a year, had some great conversations, and it's been really fun. So you can find it on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. It's called The Total Entrepreneur. And yeah, you can find my website, johnmtorrens.com.
Amazing. And I'll put the links to all of those in the show notes as well. And I urge everybody to go check those out, because I've very much enjoyed our conversation today. I enjoyed your TED talk, and yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on, being able to borrow your brain for an hour and lean on your expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jack. This is fun.
No worries at all.